Good evening, everybody. It's Mark Steiner. Good to have you with us here in The Real News. And we have a very special broadcast this evening. On this May Day that celebrates the struggles of working people, we remember Freddie Gray, who died at the hands of the Baltimore police 5 years ago. Arrested and critically injured on April the 12th, Freddie died on April the 19th. May 1st, 2015, State's Attorney Marilyn Mosby announced the indictments of 6 police officers who were all acquitted. On this day 5 years ago, we were in the midst of mass protests and resistance. So we take you back to those moments, but most importantly, we're going to talk together tonight about where we have come in these last 5 years, what has changed in the lives of the people of Sandtown, where Freddie lived, and all the Sandtowns of Baltimore. We'll be joined by people who are involved in that protest, who are activists every day of their lives, and are putting in the work to change society. Dr. Lawrence Brown, the Reverend Dr. Eva Brown, Neka Namdi, Tawanda Jones will be joining us, and in the chat room will be Tawanda Jones and our co-producer, Erica Blount Danois. So please join this video and join the chat. This is Freddie Gray, 5 years later, what has changed? Please join us in that chat room, speak your mind, submit your questions, look at the video, enjoy. It's been 5 years since Freddie Gray died at the hands of the Baltimore City Police. That day, Freddie Gray was standing on the corner, a young man beloved by the people in his neighborhood and community. To the police, he was just a black kid up to no good. His death became a breaking point. It led to massive demonstrations and exposed all the inequality created by the history of systemic racism in Baltimore and around the country. We have to ask the question, after Freddie's death, after the indictments and trials and acquittal of the officers, and millions of dollars pouring in initially, what really has changed for the people in Sandtown, the neighborhood where Freddie lived and was arrested those 5 years ago? Let's start by taking you back 5 years.
My name is Brianna Briscoe. I have to say that the killing of Freddie Gray was not right. I mean, although he had a pocket knife, they shouldn't have killed him. That wasn't right. And he used to do things for us and people in my classroom. Like, if the ice cream truck came around, he used to buy us ice cream. He used to take us out to eat. Like, I miss him so much. He was like a brother, and he always used to play with my sister.
And why do you think that the police are acting like this?
Because, like, they don't like us, so they just trying to, like, gun us. They gunning innocent people down for no apparent reason. All I have to say is Black Lives Matter, and it does matter, and I think it's going to change if they take Freddie to justice. I miss Freddie, and even though he's in heaven, I hope he hears his message. I love you so much.
To read this, it says the simple words in here. It said Freddie joined the Rural Light Missionary Baptist Church in 2001, where he joined the youth choir and was a junior usher. Did you see it? He loved church, sponsored events, the latest fashions and sports. He played football with the Sandtown Wolverines. Did you see it?
A huge, peaceful group, multiracial and multigendered, began protesting police brutality after learning of Freddie Gray's injuries in police custody. It included fractured vertebrae and a severed spine at his neck that led to his death.
Basically, we started at Gilmore Homes by Freddie Gray Murrow, and I'll never forget, we marched from there over to the police district and whatnot over in West Baltimore that was responsible for Freddie Gray brutal murder. And from there, and I remember everything being real peaceful and whatnot. And I remember being, my arms and my family member arms were locked with his family member arms. We were walking peacefully.
Near Frederick Douglass High School, a few miles away from the Western Police District Station, the police began a standoff with children at the end of their school day.
And so on this emotionally charged day, when Freddie Gray is laid to rest in the morning, the children come out of school, they're locked and blocked from going home And that's when everything descends into the uprising as we know it.
The subway was closed. No buses arrived, so the students from Douglas High had nowhere to go, but in direct confrontation with the police. To this day, no one has taken responsibility for shutting down the transportation system.
400 years of resentment built up in folks, and everybody, every community, every person has a breaking point. And so I had kind of feared that we had gotten to our breaking point, and that is very dangerous, specifically when people don't have any kind of strategy or tactics, and you as a community are up against what is essentially an army. Just watching how what I perceive to be the police picking fights with children, right? So if the children at Douglas can't get on the bus to go home, and we know that most children do not live within walking distance to their school in Baltimore. That is not the reality. So I can't get on the bus, I can't get on the subway. You are blocking where I can go. What do you expect children to do? Children are going to have an emotional response because they don't have the cognition necessarily to make a fully rational decision, right?
Douglas High School students were blamed for the standoff with police that followed. But some students, like Destiny Ireland, begged to differ.
To make this clear, if the police that came up to the mall did not shut down every transportation we students have, most kids would have been home. You have to understand, if you keep kids locked up in one area, things can happen. We could have hurt each other, but some people chose to hurt the police. They say we should come in peace, but when MLK and his people protested, they sprayed them and beat them with sticks to death. So all this peace BS is crazy.
Police throw rocks at the kids throw a rock at the police, but then the police deploy tear gas. And from there, it descends into a real pitch battle of chaos, and it stretches down from Mondawmin Mall to Penn and North, where you had other incidents taking place. And so it really was a watershed moment. It was a watershed moment after Freddie Gray was laid to rest. That afternoon, Baltimore went up in flames.
The uprising began after Freddie Gray's funeral. Governor Larry Hogan instituted a curfew and called in the National Guard. It went downhill from there.
Our tent is so wide, family, that when you look around, you see really the vastness and diversity of this city. Right. And we all here together. Yes. We may not agree on everything, but guess what? You don't have to agree on everything to work together on something. Yeah. And here's the something we agree with. Police brutality in Baltimore must stop today. Yeah. We agree.
I was brutally beat by Baltimore City police officers at my home with my 3-year-old son, 3 years old at the time, in the van, attacked, violently thrown on my head after being handcuffed, hogtied, then incarcerated. The police went on to kill a man 17 days later. 2 of those 3 officers went on to kill Tyrone West.
Tyrone West was killed by police on July 18th, 2013. And for the last 7 years, every Wednesday of every week since then, his sister, Tawanda Jones, has led protests demanding justice for her brother and all victims of police brutality. It is known as West Wednesdays. National and international media descended on Baltimore. In neighborhoods and communities, they're completely ignored until the uprising.
It was kind of shameful because I'm thinking, like, where have you guys been at? We've been literally out here peacefully for week after week since my brother was first murdered. And now you guys want to show up? Like, where were you, a few years ago?
She also supports others whose family members have been killed by the police and is dedicated to working to create a more just city.
West Wednesday was established because what happened to my brother shouldn't have happened, but we knew right away that this was a systemic thing happening worldwide. It wasn't just a Baltimore thing, worldwide type of thing. Because even before Freddie Gray, I remember going to stand on the corners of New York City and protest with Eric Gardner's family. I remember flying to Ferguson with Michael Brown's family.
Baltimore has a long history of uprisings, of rioting, of people pushing back, of racial conflict in many ways. And so what happened on April 27th was really the culmination of not only the long arc of Baltimore's history playing itself out repeatedly, but also the Black Lives Matter movement, which had been underway the year before with the non-indictments of the officers that killed Mike Brown in Ferguson, the officers that killed Eric Gardner in New York. They were both not indicted December 2014.
It was a heavy time. It's a heavy mood over the city.
A 2016 Department of Justice report exposed to the world the aggressive, corrupt policing Baltimore citizens have been complaining about for years. Activists advocated in Annapolis for bills that would allow for transparency in the police department. One of those people who led the protests, the Reverend Dr. Heber Brown, began building something new and powerful in this city.
But we agree today, no matter your age, no matter where you're from, we agree in this moment that we need to, as a community, police the police because they cannot police themselves.
5 years later, where are we now? Has Baltimore fared better or worse? Is Baltimore a leader in the fight against police brutality? Or is this just a cautionary tale? Has anything been done to blunt the poverty and racism that brought this to us? Government-inspired programs, for the most part, brought about very little change. So many Baltimoreans at the grassroots level took matters into their own hands. As media attention faded away, people like Erica Bridgeford created ceasefire weekends, unifying communities against gun violence.
One of the things that came out of the Baltimore uprising as well was the birth of the Black Church Food Security Network. So maybe about 6 to 8 months prior to the uprising, I started getting this idea around a community-led food system. My church, Pleasant Hope Baptist Church, had been growing in a front yard garden for some time, and we were seeing so many wonderful benefits from growing our own food right there at the church that I started to think about what could it look like to connect some dots and get all these churches, as many as we could, historically African-American congregations, to grow food on the land that they own. I wanted to stay on the land that they own because of gentrification and everything else in the city. And we had learned that there were many community gardens around the country that were growing on city-owned land, and then developers would come in and rip the garden away from them. And so our focus was on church-owned land to help create a buffer there.
Nneka Nnamdi is founder and CEO of Fight Blight Be More.
Freddie Gray's killing or murder, however you want to classify it, is emblematic of things that happen to people who live in blighted communities. It is a symptom of a larger problem, just like blight is a symptom of a larger problem.
If you ask people who live in Sandtown, the home of Freddie Gray, or any of the other communities across Baltimore that suffer the same isolation of inner city poverty, if much has changed in the last 5 years, the answer would be a resounding no.
The root causes of the problem, the root of the issue that caused Freddie Gray hasn't changed. You have not seen the criminalization of landlords who essentially poisoned their tenants with lead. We haven't seen, I haven't seen a big group of those landlords go to jail, right? We haven't seen police in large numbers who have been terrorizing communities. We haven't seen them go to jail. We haven't seen the philosophy about social justice change to stop pathologizing the ways in which Black people survive the terrorism that is America, right? We haven't seen any of those changes. We've seen people doing dope programming to help, change folks' individual understandings and maybe people's individual situations. But in terms of fundamental collective change in the way communities are treated, no, we haven't seen any change in that way.
Malika Amanita Clemens was in the streets during the protests and is a filmmaker who produced Not About a Riot.
I think that the overall consciousness of folks have changed. As people have become more understanding, more empathetic, they're able to see outside of their personal bubbles and have an understanding of experiences that they might not. But I think for the people who have been living in police states and have been living in poverty, living in food deserts, that hasn't changed too much, which is sad.
The murder rate, which hovered around the 200s from 2012 to 2014, skyrocketed after Gray's death at the hands of the police. The police pulled out of proactive policing. In the past 5 years, there have been 5 different police commissioners, none of which have been able to calm the violence because the root of the conditions in Baltimore have not been addressed.
That was really the heart of the issue. That is, in fact, what led to the uprising, hyper-policing in the midst of a hyper-segregated city. And what we saw was that in the aftermath, neither one of those two was accurately or fully addressed. You did not have a desegregation effort to take place. You did not have an effort to make policing more fair, more just. In fact, there was a work slowdown by the BPD. They were pouting instead of actually protecting and serving people who are tax-paying citizens. They actually engaged in a work slowdown in the aftermath.
Just this past Monday, we just had another killing right here while we're under the coronavirus, in this pandemic type of thing where everybody's supposed to be in their house, staying safe type of thing and not spreading this deadly virus or whatever. We just had a police-involved shooting where a young man was murdered. But the interesting, sad part, the cop that murdered this young man, this is his 5th body. This is the 5th person that he murdered.
It all goes back to where the investment and divestment decisions are made. And the bottom line is investment is made in white communities and in retail areas in Baltimore, retail and commercial areas. So your Canton, your Harbor East, your Port Covington, where in Park Heights, where in Emerson Village, where in Ashburton, you don't have those types of investments. In fact, you have disinvestment.
All of the corporations who are funding the city and pushing money into the city, if they were like, hey, we're opening this space for people who don't have housing, and they're going to live there for free for this amount of time. If they came together and did something like that, then it would happen. Like, I don't have any doubt that it would happen. So yeah, I think it's a combination of the people, which is us, which is everyone coming to some type of united front about what the needs are to make the situation better, and then holding the folks accountable who can actually apply that.
Governor Hogan scrapped the plan for the Red Line in the city, a city desperate for a functional transportation system as an economic lifeline for jobs. During the uprisings, then President Barack Obama and the Baltimore mayor then, Stephanie Rawlings Blake, referred to young people involved in the resistance as thugs.
And the thugs.
One Baltimore was created after the uprisings by former Mayor Stephanie Rawlings Blake and Congressman Elijah Cummings. It was headed by Michael Cryer. It was supposed to pump resources, bring jobs and better housing into neglected areas of the city. It shut down in 2017. Cryer retreated frustrated, and nothing changed. Current Mayor Jack Young suggested kids learn how to box and box it out to stem the murder rate. Last month, former Mayor Catherine Pugh was sentenced to 3 years in prison on conspiracy charges. Baltimore Public Schools operated without heat, shut down in the winter. Now with COVID-19, many, if not most students, do not have access to internet learning. Congressman Elijah Cummings, a staunch advocate for Baltimore, who never left the community, passed away. Rawlings Blake left office. Recently worked for Mike Bloomberg's campaign for president, praising his track record as mayor of New York, his track record of stop and frisk policies leading to mass incarceration of black and brown people. The problems of Baltimore continued as they were. And Donald Trump referred to Baltimore as a rodent-infested mess. Since Freddie Gray's death, local and national politicians have been out of touch, literally and figuratively. What needs to happen for real change to occur in Baltimore. Let's start with Dr. Lawrence Brown, whose concept of the white L and the black butterfly changed the nature of the discussion and our understanding of the consequences of historic systemic racism that plague our communities. The white L is where white people of means live and resources abound. The black butterfly are Baltimore's east and west side black communities, where the resources are few and little investment is made.
Today's lead is still poisoning black babies and the black butterfly. So I think we have to get rid of that. That's the toxin that's lowering academic achievement. It's elevating propensity towards violence. If we don't get rid of toxic lead, we're going to stay in this same situation that we're in. So I think half of that is doing that. And then the other half is actually bringing and boosting the type of investment in the black butterfly that's needed to wipe out food apartheid, to wipe out transit apartheid. Instead of, we got a Charm City circulator that goes north-south in the white L, we need a black butterfly circulator that runs along North Avenue and circles back across East and West Baltimore for free, just the same way this Charm City circulator operates. So I think those are the types of things. Bankings, we need, Bank of America closed after Freddie Gray was murdered. You had 2 branches closed, one on Ricetown Plaza, and then another one at Mondawmin Mall. So banking apartheid has increased. So I think those are the types of things that need to happen. You need more cooperative economics and the funding to undergird it. So our anchor institutions, the anchor institutions in the city, Johns Hopkins, University of Maryland, they should be contracting with black-led cooperative entities in the Black Butterfly to provide them with the steady contracts so that you have worker owners, black worker owners who are not just getting a job, but they're able to gain ownership, power, wealth. And those are the types of things in combination in that racial equity social impact bond that would kickstart the transformation that's needed. The other thing is Baltimore neighborhood reparations, aside from the racial equity social impact bond, that should come from the city budget itself, where you have 10% of the city budget. Right now, the city budget is around $3 billion. So that's $300 million every year that should go to the top 20 or so red line black communities. And you should have a democratically elected council of people that's representative of that community, and they decide how that money gets spent every year so that they're able to allocate it towards the needs in that community. So I think between the two, a $3 billion racial equity impact bond to kickstart neighborhood reparations, and then taking 10% of the Baltimore city budget to further facilitate it for the next 30, 40, 50 years, however long it takes. We've had Baltimore apartheid for nearly 100 years, if not more. It's going to take some time to undo the damage that Baltimore apartheid has caused.
One of the things that is really horrible is the Officer Bill of Rights basically allows, it to me places the officer above the law, when in fact they should be held to a higher standard of the law, because they're the ones that are enforcing and making sure people abide by the law. So to me, until we get rid of these Officer Bill of Rights, that's old. It should have been gone. It was established, I believe, in 1974. It just needs to be gone because it places them above the law.
You can support the efforts of organizations like Brioxy and Parity Homes and Black Woman Bill and Smaltimore Homes, all of which are development organizations that are led by Black people. That 3 of those are led by Black women that are focused on doing development that is not based in gentrification, that development that is going to repair the damage, actually developing community, not just developing business, not just developing real estate, because community development is not just about the buildings, it is actually about the people.
Many of you remember corner stores were closed down, public transportation was halted for a period, and still to this day, nobody's taking responsibility for who shut down public transportation. You'll remember the school system closed schools for a couple of days. And so in a time that's not too unlike the time that we're in right now, where social supports and safety net programs and government kind of backed off from the local community, we had to come up with something to feed ourselves. And people had heard about this church called Pleasant Hope that's growing food. And so when they called us, we started moving food to people who called. So you had Black farmers, you had the Black church, you had the Black community, and you had this kind of spirit of self-reliance working through this configuration, this triangle, and then having kind of a ripple effect and supporting others as well. So 5 years later, we're still doing that work. It's called the Black Church Food Security Network, but it's grown so far beyond Baltimore now. We have congregations and partners in Ohio, North Carolina, Virginia, DC, Tennessee, and it just keeps on going on, because especially with this global pandemic, climate change, economic violence, and everything else, it doesn't take long for people to realize we need food. The first thing people did when Governor Larry Hogan said, stay at home by 8 o'clock tonight, or whatever that day was, so many of us went to where? The grocery store, and lined up and got food. And so this is an important time for our organization where we are now. We've launched a seed bank. We have thousands of seeds, and we are mailing seeds around the country. We're doing a DIY backyard garden series, and really helping to remember people back to what your grandparents did anyway, or your great-grandparents. Canning, seed saving, that type of thing. People don't think about it as political work or social justice work, but it definitely is. Having a little piece of land and some seeds and knowing how to keep your produce growing and grow your own food, it's very important work. And I have to point to the Baltimore Uprising and say that this organization and our work came out of that time in a very profound way.
So here we are 5 years later, and we find ourselves in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. Freddie Gray was a victim of a different pandemic. The pandemic of violence, of poverty that plagues inner city communities. He lived with and was stricken with a pandemic of lead paint poisoning that wreaks havoc on the mind and body, affects the development of the brain, makes one prone to irrationality and violence, and weakens the immune system. That much hasn't changed if you live in Freddie Gray's neighborhood. There has been one kind of change, though. Gilmore homes, the public housing project where Freddie Gray lived, are being demolished. With no real plans for where its residents may end up, many community members will be displaced. And they may even try to tear down Freddie's mural at the spot where he was arrested, an arrest that caused his death. While grassroots movements continue and creative projects are born from the people who play significant roles in that rebellion, the government seems to have continued to abandon the people. It seems as though the city is not caught up with those creative minds to provide the resources, create the policies, or use their imaginations towards ending the poverty and isolation for people in places like Sandtown and Gilmore homes. But the people have not given up, and neither should we, until equity and justice are a reality. Well, welcome back here to our conversation. I hope you enjoyed that video that was produced by Erica Blount-Danois and Cameron Grandino and myself at the Real News Network. And we're joined in this conversation now. We want to continue the conversation in the chat on the side of the YouTube. Ask your questions, join us with your thoughts. We have a few of them now. We're going to get to your ideas and thoughts in this thing. We're joined here by Nneka Nnamdi, who is a technical archivist with expertise in applying cultural technology for personal and community wellness. She's director of community development for the Living Well Center, and she is the creator and head of Flight Blight Baltimore. Nneka, good to have you with us. COO, I should say, of Flight Blight Baltimore. And we are joined by the Reverend Dr. Heber Brown, who is pastor of Pleasant Hope Baptist Church and the founder and executive director of the Black Church Food Network that you heard a moment ago. And we'll also be joined here in just a minute by Dr. Lawrence Brown, who is a scholar, public health advocate. He studies a historical trauma that affects community health in our societies. Was at Morgan State University, where he's an associate professor. Now he's at the University of Wisconsin Population Health Institute, and is the man, of course, who created the white elm black butterfly. So let's jump off with the kind of the leading question before we look at what our viewers are writing in chat and get their ideas in here. And begin with just looking at these last 5 years. And, you know, you drive around the city, you see what's going on. What has changed? I mean, the conditions that killed Freddie Gray are still killing people. Nneka, let me start with you.
I would have to say the speed at which gentrification is happening, or genocide in the Black community is happening, it has sped up. It is actually moving faster than it probably was in the past, in part because there is more attention being placed on reclaiming this idea of like reclaiming or re-colonializing the city. And so I would have to say the main thing that has changed, at least at the government and at the level of real estate development, is the speed at which gentrification is happening.
Heber?
Yeah, I trust that that insight analysis sounds spot on in terms of things being ramped up from the government and the developer side of things. It's interesting as well, and I'm curious to hear from the rest of this panel about the nature of community organizing and activism in light of this current moment that we're in as well. Certainly there's so much that's going on in terms of wonderful programs and creative strategies for lifting up, organizing, and building up local communities behind certain issues. But as I watched the documentary this evening, questions started to arise in my head about the mood, the tenor, the energy around street level direct activism in the city right now. I wonder if the hydra of Baltimore apartheid, as Dr. Brown alluded to, is taking a little bit of a toll, or this is a deep breath that we're taking as a community. And even as I say that, I recognize there's so many young activists out here doing wonderful, inspiring things, but I'm just looking at what the mood and energy was in that moment, which of course was an intensification of what we've been doing for so many years. But it is interesting to compare the two times in terms of the condition, the nature, the fabric and character of organizing and community activism right now. So,
Lawrence, you with us yet?
Yes, I'm here.
Oh, good. So let me let you jump in. I didn't know you were there. I'm sorry, man. So I'm glad you're with us here. So let me give your response to that as well. Then we'll jump into some of these questions that people have and kind of examine then what we can do to change this. What do we have to push for? But go ahead, Lawrence.
Well, first of all, it's great to join you all and your esteemed fellow panelists, and you, Mark, as well. I think when we talk about what's changed in the last 5 years, we have to start with the national context. We've gone from President Obama to President Trump. We've gone from basically a Democratic president, and a lot of Democrats are pro-corporate, to really apartheid, hyper-police sort of framework at the national level. I think Baltimore, it's interesting to hear what both panelists have said so far. To speak to the first point, I think, gentrification, we saw that accelerate with the way that Kevin Plank received $660 million, his real estate firm, Sagamore Development Corporation, just 1 year after the uprising. And that's $660 million that could have gone to repair and heal the Black Butterfly and Red Line Black neighborhoods, but it went to the corner of the white L, a billionaire who didn't need that money. And I think, the points that Reverend Brown has made as well is something to wonder about, the energy of the city. Mark, at the end of your wonderful documentary, you talked about the pandemics of poverty, of violence, of hyper-policing of toxic lead that Freddie Gray faced while he was alive. And I don't think that those pandemics have been solved since. Murders have gone up. Toxic lead still remains. The police is still not accountable. It's under a consent decree now. And poverty hasn't been ameliorated. So I think many of the same conditions exist, although I think the organizing in the city actually became much more sophisticated. People are much more aware of root causes, I think at a more intelligent way. And so actually you saw the city council turnover, about half of the city council, you saw new elections take place. So you have a new political energy. We may have Baltimore may see a new mayor that didn't come through, I think, more of the traditional channels in 2020. So there could be seeds of hope. There could be seeds of change that were planted by the uprising that are still being fully developed to this day.
So let's begin with one thing you said here. There was a question from one of the people in our chat room here talking back and forth about what we've been talking about and what they've just seen. And let's talk about that consent decree for a moment. I mean, Tawanda Jones, who's in the chat room, who's been leading West Wednesdays ever since her brother Tyrone West was killed by the police, has not missed a Wednesday to stand up and speak and be seen and heard, fight for her brother and other victims. And so the question is, where are we with this consent decree? I mean, Heber, let me start with you on this one, and then everybody please jump in. I mean, this happened. There was a huge hue and cry. The federal government came in for a minute. Barack Obama was president, so his attorney general was a little bit more proactive than the man who's sitting there at the moment. But let's talk just a bit about where you think this is and why is it so difficult for us to put our hands around this?
You know, it's interesting. I think that a part of the consent decree process, and I've been at some of the meetings, but I got to be honest, there's a high level of skepticism about if anything's going to come out of it. And I think, you know, it's an understandable position that many people in Baltimore would have when you consider generations of systemic oppression against Black folk. And so the skepticism is there. It's real. It's a healthy skepticism, I believe. You know what? I'm sitting here thinking about the ways in which the consent decree process and all the meetings and things that are even happening now, could it have sucked some of the energy out of the outside of the system activism that's needed to help balance that inside of the system reform? I wonder if through that process and, you know, through the energy and the focus there, and many of the people who were on the front lines of helping to lead things and push things forward pre-uprising, in the middle of the uprising, and still to this day, being sucked into that long. I mean, it's a deep, long, and intense process. It's a lot of meetings. It's a lot of talking to people that you never met before, and you're repeating yourself over and over again about what you think the problems are, and very slow wheels of change. There's a book that I read some years ago called The Revolution Will Not Be Funded, Beyond the Nonprofit Industrial Complex by the Insight, a group called Insight. And they talked about how many of the activists of the 60s, you know, the question was raised, where did they go? And somebody said they got jobs and they got elected. And I wonder to what degree was it, you know, could pieces of this have been a chess move by the government to siphon some of the radical, direct confrontation energy out of this balloon, and kind of flatten the tire a little bit on that outside pressure. I mean, because if everybody's inside working through the process in the meetings and going through all that, and there's nobody outside with the big stick saying, if you don't work with them, you're going to have a problem with me, then I wonder how much that impacts long-term organizing and long-term activism as well.
Well, picking up that theme, Nneka, there was somebody just wrote in our chat room here. What do you think it will take for the government to actively work with citizens as partners? We're not looking for a savior, quote unquote. We want to be heard as equals and to work as co-partners. And you're in the midst of that battle, as many of you are on this panel. But talk a bit about that in response to what Heber said and what our viewer was saying on chat.
So I think that it is very difficult because I do think they are in a way sucking the air out of and the energy out of activists to, to have to repeat yourself, to have to explain to people 11 times that, your concept of officer friendly looks like the Klan to me. Like those things over and over and over again do start to deflate you. There's a book called Protest Psychosis, and it talks about, in part, how many of the activists in the 60s ended up with mental illness because of the strain and stress of that. But also, it is very trying on a daily basis to have to engage with folks in city and state government who, for whatever reason, continue to personalize the realities of systems and issues that were decisions that were made 40 years ago. And they're still trying to cover them up. They're still trying to uphold them. And so it makes it's tiring because you're going back and forth with the same thing over and over again. And so I don't know. I think part of it does have to do with changing who is sitting in these particular seats. But the other piece is the mechanism. We have to be honest that the mechanism itself is encoded in a way to undermine an actual shift in power, not the appearance of power, like the appearance that the people have power, but actual power being in the hands of the people. So it's a dichotomy there. And there are a lot of things I have answers to. That particular one isn't one of them. I just think that we have to keep pushing and we have to keep pulling.
So, and speaking of pushing and pulling, Lawrence, I was thinking about what both Heber and Eka said, but also thinking about what you said inside the documentary itself, where you really, you posited some things about actual things that we could change, whether it comes from the notion of reparations, the idea of workers' co-ops. Talk a bit about what you think is a force those things are and how you make those forces happen, how you push to make that happen. I'm thinking, John Conyers introduced reparations how many decades ago? People are just now beginning to take it seriously in the broader sense. So talk a bit about that push and what you think can happen, how it should happen.
I definitely hear what Reverend Brown and Miss Namdi has said, but I also wonder if on one hand you have that dynamic of funneling or the way in which maybe that has been thwarted due to the traumatic structure. But on the other hand, I also know that we went from Anthony Batts, then we went to D'Souza, and then there was when D'Souza went to jail, there was the thought of bringing in Joel Fitzgerald, who was a Trump-loving sheriff down in Fort Worth, and activists actually got together and thwarted his nomination, and you ended up with Michael Harrison as the police commissioner. And so, it remains to be seen if Michael Harrison is bringing along the department in the way that it should be brought. I think over time, you'll get a fuller verdict. But I think it is true that by preventing Joel Fitzgerald from coming in, there was a tangible win. Because even if Harrison is decent, I believe Fitzgerald would have been terrible. So you still have a net gain there in terms of the police commissioner. And I think activists helped make sure that Fitzgerald's nomination wasn't a reality. But I think, to your question, Mark, I would say the way that we would cause these sort of more progressive policies to take place is to really, I think, first understand the way government is functioning, the way that democracy is thwarted by the corruption we've seen in the past 5 years. University of Maryland medical system, and the way that they took money from then Senator and then afterwards Mayor Pugh to undermine the way that the public will was being operated. You saw Johns Hopkins, they donated to get their private police force. So to get what we want as a people, we have to stop the corruption, stop these corporations from imposing their will on our government, which blocks the will of the people.
So let me pick up on that here. There's another comment here that fits right into what you all were saying. And let's talk about this for a moment. The comment is this: the revolution will not be funded. Phew, that part. How do you come back to not chasing grants with money, but to be serious about collective infrastructure and community power build. And let me tack on to that question. The struggle in the 60s, the civil rights struggle, the anti-war movement, the Black Panther Party, the Young Lords, all the things that happened there forced the government to begin programs to kind of address poverty and open things up at the end of segregation. It also began with deindustrialization. Then conservatives' power kept creeping back in and destroyed whatever programs government was creating and pushed people into foundations. Then you got to follow their agenda if you want to change things. So that at the heart, that to me is what is behind this question. And so the question becomes then, what do you do instead? How do you build a movement and build the structures you're talking about that actually create the change, that force the change? I mean, that's where we are at this moment. So let's tackle that one. And Heber, let me let you tackle it first.
Well, I'm going to sound like a broken record here, Mark, because Doc Brown. When I find something that works for me, I kind of stick and sing that note. I just hold my note. I sing on the choir. Other people sing other parts. So my note from where I sit is that when I recognize that it is money behind a candidate, I got a crash course doing a lot of activism and organizing in Annapolis. I thought my civics teacher taught me the real deal in terms of how a bill becomes a law. Until I went to Annapolis and was working with so many people to try to address police accountability issues at the state level. And I learned that it was money. You can have the right ethical position, the moral position, you can have the statistics, you can have the reports, you can bring all of that to the table. But if money says no, then it's not going to move forward. And I had an elected official at the time tell me that straight out. He said, Reverend Brown, we'd love to pass some of these 17 different bills that you all have helped to shepherd down here. But the police union doesn't like these bills. And so we can't pass them if they don't like it. And that, for me, signaled that it was time for me to leave. That space, while it is an important space, and I'm grateful for the people who are gifted in that space, to make the change at state government level, at city government level. That's very important. It's not my important. My important really is wrapped up in the pulpit that I sit in. And so when I consider the assets of Black churches and all the communities around neighborhoods around the city of Baltimore and even beyond Baltimore, really, when you talk about assets in terms of organized people, organized money, assets in buildings and land and commercial kitchens and vans, for me, that is the space that helps to push back and balance out the power arrangement. We don't have the same level of money as a Bloomberg. We don't have, in terms of churches, the same amount of money as a Johns Hopkins. But when you got organized people with some manner of cooperative economics built into the fabric of what we do every 7 days without thinking or blinking, then I feel like it gives us a running start in the Black community as an anchor institution alongside Hopkins and the rest, but in a different kind of way. And so in a way to really lift up that as something that can be a part of an engine, maybe one of the pistons in an engine, to get some momentum around challenging the power dynamics, around organizing our everyday Black folk in the city of Baltimore, organizing everyday folk in the city of Baltimore. The Black church has to be in that conversation. Vernon Johns, Albert Clegg, so Amos Wilson, so many others have pointed to the Black church as at least having to be in the picture somewhere. And that is what I'm dedicating the rest of my life to, and the past, I don't know how many years to, of helping churches not to be appendages of the white power structure, challenging pastors not to parrot conservative right-wing theologies and pass it off as the word of God, but to lift up and preach about this first century Palestinian Jew who dared to stand up against the empire of his day and was lynched because of it and sparked a movement that we are still seeing the ripple effect of at its best around the world to this day. And so that's where I think we have to look at least one of the spaces to look at.
And Neka, let me ask you about the space you've been working in when you have this organization called Blight Baltimore, and I'm one of those people who's old enough to remember Sandtown, the neighborhood where Freddie Gray grew up, that when it was a place where most people worked, where people had homes, some rented, some were buying homes, that there were families that were together. It was a community, poor and struggling, but a community. And now it's blight. Now it's boarded up houses. Now it's gentrification all through the white L, as Lawrence talks about. And in the blighted parts of the east and west side, it's just forgotten. It's dystopian. And people are poisoned by lead. So your organization about Fight Blight has to take on gentrification and more. So talk a bit about what your vision would be and how you change that.
So I think the most important part is for us to first of all acknowledge that all of the things that you said were true, but there also is a very vibrant and thriving community in places like Sandtown and in Upton and in Harlem Park. And one of the biggest things that we have to work on doing or not doing anymore is pathologizing the ways in which Black people thrive and survive under this white supremacist system. And so, from an economic standpoint, it becomes, it isn't tricky. It's just simply identifying the ways in which we have cultural technology that we could be leveraging for economic gains that get pathologized. So I'll give two quick examples. One, if you're from Baltimore, you know what a hack is, right? They were, it was community. It was, typically elder men in the community who were retired, who provided low-cost transportation to the community. Because as you know, Baltimore's transportation system sucks today, and it has been sucking, right? But they were, those hacks were made illegal. And imagine if the city of Baltimore, in thinking about equity years ago, had supported the development of hacks as a cooperative transportation model. So then the corporate headquarters of Uber is not wherever it is, it would be in Baltimore, right? But instead of supporting that cultural technology, it was criminalized. Another good example would be, Arabs, right? Again, providing food to community, providing transportation of food. Imagine if the city had spent as much energy on helping to support the development of the Arabs as they are in developing Pimlico, right? So for me, my focus is on supporting that culture, those elements of cultural technology surrounding real estate development. So effectively working on issues of Black land sovereignty, making sure that all of those elders and ancestors who worked very hard, paying 3 times what they should have for properties, that their heirs are able to hold on to those, develop those properties, so those properties then see for the next generation, so that instead of having to whomever the money decides to put forward as the candidate of choice for Black people, we're able to develop the mechanisms in-house that we are vetting, that we are funding, that we are platforming, that then we are voting for and holding accountable those that we identify in our community as ones that we want to go and engage with the political system on our behalf. But that starts with having to have, a couple extra coins. And that couple extra coins, most of the time, comes from having home ownership, having, owned a home and have it be in good condition and have equity inside of that community that you can then access. And so my focus is on that. And we can do it. We're doing it. And we just have to continue to do those small things individually in our families, and then through our anchor institutions like the church, like Woundworks, like LBS, like all of those institutions, we have to continue to work at the ground level to create a different future.
Before I turn to Lawrence here with this, to pick up on that, I mean, what you're saying and what Lawrence said in the video, what Heber, you were talking about in terms of the Food Network, what Tawanda Jones was talking about in terms of reforming the police, it made me think, Lawrence, that one of the things is how this push happens. And a couple of questions here lead me into something that you've talked about and how maybe all these things fit together. People chatted in saying, how can we believe investment is needed to improve Black and brown communities? Wouldn't investment generate gentrification? And then somebody else said, do you think the government is too big to stop if it has nefarious motives for its actions? What could we really do to have that power? And two of the things you talked about, and these are political questions. One's an organizing question, and the other is a political push. The organizing thing is you talked about Black worker co-ops to be able to change the city and the nature of employment. And you talked about reparations and money that has to be put into the community as reparations should be done in terms of changing the nature of this community. So I mean, and all of you are involved in these different parts of the struggle, but these are the things that change things. So talk a bit about that idea. I mean, this is how you organize and change things, it seems to me.
Was that question for me, Mark? Oh, okay.
That's for you, Lawrence.
I want to lift up in vein of your question, the way Reverend Brown talked about the Black church as a pivotal seminal institution, the way Ms. Namdi talked about the way that you have cultural technologies, resilient Black organizations in communities. My thing is, can we get the government to stop working against those efforts that are being pushed in the community and start working for them? And I think the way we look at that is through the frame of racial equity and realizing that Baltimore City intentionally created policies, racial zoning, racially restrictive covenants, redlining, and that these policies are the root of the issues that we have in the Black butterfly, and therefore to really foster healing, to foster the community development, and to the question in the chat, we want development without displacement. The way you do that is you ensure that the people that live in those communities have a major democratic say in the way development takes place in that community. And one of the ways that I've talked about that we should fund it is through two ways: the Racial Equity Social Impact Bond, which would $3 billion, half of it getting rid of lead in Black communities, the other half addressing transit apartheid, banking apartheid, food apartheid in these communities. Food apartheid means we could take $300 million of that money, put it towards Reverend Brown's initiative, so that we can have a resilient food sovereignty network that's actually proliferating in Baltimore City, giving people fresh fruits and vegetables, that you would have money allocated towards the companies that like Fight Blight and the other companies that she mentioned that would help actually address Black-led development, Black worker cooperatives, Black food cooperatives. The funding should come from the city government, which has denied redline Black neighborhoods for so long. So my interest is really in saying, how can we get our own city governments to stop working against these wonderful efforts and actually working on their behavior, because they actually help cause the issues to begin with.
So, I mean, it seems to me that it's almost political action, it's organizing that changes this. And all of you have been involved in this at some level. Before I jump into that, Heber, there's one question came up that somebody really wants to know. That it's your question, so I have to ask you. Do you have any numbers on food cultivation? How successful has that been for you?
It's been quite successful. And so my church, Pleasant Hope Baptist Church, I should say the church I'm blessed to be a part of, Pleasant Hope Baptist Church, we've been growing now for a decade on 1,500 square feet and growing about 1,100, 1,200 pounds of produce. I mean, that really was the spark that made me think, like, wow, if our one average sized church can do this by aligning and organizing our resources and getting people jazzed and lined up behind this vision, what more could happen? And so we have 11, 12 congregations around Baltimore now that are growing on their land that we help to support and provide technical assistance and training. In fact, we have a training tomorrow called Grocery Store Gardening, where we are teaching people how to take that lettuce from the grocery store. I mean, in light of what we're going through right now, Grocery stores popping right now. Nobody going to the mall and the movies, nowhere else. You're going to the grocery store. And so we want to teach people how to buy certain things from the grocery store, bring it home, regrow it at home, and take a step deeper into the agrarian lifestyle. One of my patron saints of my life and of this organization, his name is Reverend Vernon Johns, who was the OG to Martin Luther King Jr. and so many of the younger preachers of that day. Reverend Vernon Johns, he would often encourage African Americans to make connections between the city and rural communities. In fact, he would try to get, nothing I'm doing is new, or like Heber Brown has this wonderful idea. No, I just read the footnotes of books of our ancestors. And they said, if you make these connections, it allows for economic benefit, health, wealth. I also got to add the Nation of Islam, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, and the NOI have been kind of pushing this for years upon years. And so it's nothing new that I'm doing. Reverend Vernon Johns, though, said $100 will send its roots deeper in soil than $1,000 will send its roots in cement. He was trying to get Black folk to see that if you put your money in soil, in land, in growing and cultivating, that it gives you the momentum that you need to do some other things. And so as Dr. Brown talked about bond bill, my mind immediately went to, you need a force that's going to push that bond bill, that's going to make elected officials vote for it. And that's where I see one of the connections between the political piece and the community organizing piece. Because if you leave it to professional advocates to do all of the work around these proposals, it's only going to go so far, and it could be out of touch with what everyday folks on the block are talking about. And so it's an important connection there. But in terms of seeing a difference, absolutely. Churches in Ohio, Virginia, North Carolina. I just got a call right before coming on tonight from the Baptist Convention of Virginia. The churches down there want to connect. So I'm really excited about the potential of following the direction of what so many, George Washington Carver, Carter G. Woodson, so many, they've been saying try it. So I want to learn from them and at least move the ball one step forward and try to give somebody behind me a running start into this direction as well.
I mean, I think that, you mentioned Vernon Johns. It's a quick aside. I had the unique pleasure of doing this documentary, King's Barber, in Montgomery, to meet a number of people who were Vernon Johns's parishioners when he was in charge of that church. And they told me this beautiful story about how he came up one Sunday morning, freaked out a lot of people, but a lot of people loved it. He was wearing his overalls, not his suit, held up some broccoli and a watermelon, and started preaching about why we have to grow these. And there was this great picture of him doing that they had. It immediately popped in my head as you were telling the story about Vernon Johns. It was an amazing.
And shortly after that, Mark, they kicked him out the church, and so I'm grateful that things have changed enough that I've not gotten voted out of my church yet. Shout out to Vernon Johns.
Let's hope that doesn't happen. I don't think it will. So we don't have a lot of time left here. So there's another piece came in here. This was a question from Oakland, California. And says he wants Mayor Schaaf to join Mayor Schul of Durham, North Carolina, in calling for reparations for descendants of American slaves. So let's talk a bit about this notion of reparation and how this fits into investment. That's not just gentrification. And respond to this person. I don't know if it's a man or woman, but respond to this person from Oakland and what they're saying to bring the mayors together to force them to fight for this. And let's start with you on this one, Lawrence, then go to Nneka and close out with Heber, because you raised the issue in the documentary itself. Lawrence, go ahead.
Yes, so I mentioned earlier, one solution being the racial equity social impact bond, $3 billion from private and folks that have means to do that. The other solution that I pose is Baltimore neighborhood reparations, because those policies I mentioned earlier, they damage Black neighborhoods. And so that's where the repairing needs to happen. And so the way that I talk about this in a book that's already been published, Revisiting Baltimore, the title is something like that. In that book, I talk about taking 10% of the Baltimore city budget, which is around $3 billion before this catastrophe that we're in right now with the pandemic, $3 billion in years previously, So 10% of that is $300 million. You take that, you allocate it to the top 20 or so red line Black communities in the city. So they'd end up with around $25 million. And then you have a democratically elected board of people who live in that community. And you make sure you have not racial, but since it's a Black neighborhood, it's going to be mostly Black people, but you make sure you have gender, orientation, the way you have, real diversity in terms of who's living in that community, age, youth, elders. You make sure you have a good representative group of 15 people that live in that community, and they decide and work with the community to figure out how are we going to spend this money to help repair the damage that's been done in our neighborhood. How do we give money to WombWorks? How do we give money to the Food Sovereignty Project? How do we, send our children to college? How do we spend some of this money to get rid of lead? So Black neighborhood reparations, not waiting on the federal government to give reparations, we want that too. But we want the city of Baltimore, which created urban apartheid in America, to make amends for the damage that it has done as well.
Let me turn on to NECA. As a little aside here, again, we're broadcasting it from Baltimore. Lawrence is joining us from Wisconsin, where he lives now, teaching. And this is probably the truth in every city in the country, from what you were saying. Almost every, if there's a place in Baltimore Unitarian Church has a house. If you look in that house, all across the top of the inside of their meeting house are names of people, Marylanders. I looked at those names. A, I realized they were all street names in Baltimore. But B, I realized that 90% of the people's names on that wall were slave owners.
How about it?
Had enslaved people. So, that to me speaks directly what we're talking about, that it's not just national, it's also local, everywhere in this country. NECA, go ahead. I'm sorry. I just had to say that after Lawrence said.
I would say even that, broader it's an international struggle, because in all honesty, colonialism and capitalism are the forerunners of enslavement in the way that we understand it. And so I think that there are levels to the reparations dialogue, but I think that Dr. Brown is exactly on top of it. In fact, this week, I challenge people on Facebook to tag their city council persons and ask them where they were in terms of looking at the work that he had already done and bringing that into fruition. I wasn't happy with some of the responses I got, but that's fine. We need to understand where these elected officials are. But I think it's key to understand that reparations is at its lowest common denominator is about repairing the damage done, right? And that damage is economic, that damage is spiritual, that damage is cultural, it's familial. It's all the mere fact that there's any separation in how Black folks feel about each other between country folks and city folks, that is an avenue for repair, especially when you understand that many of the folks who are in Baltimore, families came out of North Carolina, came out of South Carolina, came out of Georgia, and they came here many times as a direct result of racial violence in the South, right? Or lack of economic opportunity in the South. And they just came into a different kind of racism and terror in Baltimore. But the fact that there's been a dichotomy created in our community is a place where we have to have some repair. And part of the repair is bringing back those stories, and understanding how the Black church supported the freedom cause of Black folks, but also understanding what your grandparents sacrificed to buy that house on Mount Street. And why it was that they weren't necessarily home to be on top of the children because they were working 3 jobs, because they had a contract loan. And if they missed a payment, even the last payment, they could lose the entire house. Understanding those stories, understanding how that impacts the larger community, and understanding how the policies of the city, state, and federal government cause those things, help people to understand why the descendants of American enslavement deserve reparations, because our ancestors weren't slaves, they were enslaved. And there's a difference semantically there.
That's a huge difference, philosophically, semantically, and reality. Heber Brown, close us out.
Sure. Real quick on the reparations question. You know, I'm really interested. I'm really inspired and interested. For one, Doc Brown with White L and Black Butterfly, it's gone around the world. People around the globe lift that up as a way to understand what's going on in their community. And so, I mean, you should be commended for you putting that forward. And I'm interested as well, the degree to which the next level of that analysis could help us get some running steam and running start, or the next step rather, to the reparations question. When you look at the White L, I would be curious to name the names and name the companies that benefited from the TIFs. And I've seen the wonderful work you've done with the TIFs, and you've kind of laid that out. But just in that same visual way that we can look at the map and you have the L and the wings, what would it look like to place the names of the companies in the L and the names of the ones that left out of the wings, so that we can at least start to get a little bit closer to, as one of my mentors says, name the demons that haunt us. That's for one. For two, Alderwoman Dorothy Tillman in Chicago in the early 2000s, I believe 2002, organized an effort and got an ordinance passed in Chicago, the Slavery Era Disclosure Ordinance, where any corporation seeking to do business with the city had to disclose whether or not they had any business or financial ties with the enslavement of African people. Now, the decision on whether or not they would get the contract would not swing on the hinge of if they had been a part of slavery in any way. But what it did was created an archive. Now we have it chronicled that these are the businesses. Here are the records. And I think for so much of the reparations movement, those records are needed. We need the information. And so I got to tip my hat tonight as well to Alderwoman Dorothy Tillman in Chicago and lift that up as a potential. And I know other places did it as well, but lift it up as something that could be a possibility for Baltimore. As you just said, Mark, the names of the people that are at the top of many of the buildings, you said, enslaved African people. And they're the names of streets and schools and buildings all over the city. What would it, and some of those families, let's go ahead and let it all out. Some of those families are still here in the area, Mark. Oh, yeah. Some of the families who had ancestors who enslaved African people in Baltimore City are still in the area. What would it look like to have a slavery era disclosure ordinance in Baltimore? Can we get elected officials currently or those coming in to commit to say, I would support a slavery era disclosure ordinance or bill here in the city? And then at least now we start naming names, naming companies, getting the record together so that the Dr. Lawrence Brown coming behind, the Sister Namdi coming behind, the Heber Brown coming behind, now they got a running start. They ain't got to start from scratch. Here you go. Here's the information. Here's the map. Watch Mark Steiner's program and take it 2 steps further. I think every generation got to build on the previous one. And so perhaps that could be something that gives a running start, not only to us, but to those who are coming behind us as well.
I think now we have an idea for our next program. This is a great idea. I love it. You know, and I actually know one of my old students many years ago in the 80s is a descendant of one of those families. She was really aware of it. And I'll have to introduce you all. She'd be one of those people who would say, yes, you're right. I'll speak out about that. That's important stuff, I think. This has been a great conversation. First of all, I want to thank Heber Brown and Lawrence Brown and Neka Namdi for joining us here at the discussion, being part of our video documentary, along with Tawanda Jones, who's central to building a movement in this city and who is helping run the chat room tonight and was also in our video. I really appreciate you taking the time. I want to thank my two partners in this, Cameron Grandino and Erica Blanc-Amois, who helped produce this, and Cameron did the incredible job of editing all of this, and all the folks at Real News who pitched in to make this night happen. And Dwayne Glad, of course, who's making tonight work, making this all come out for the public. So thank you all for joining us tonight, and thank all of our guests and participants in this project for being with us. And we have to remember Freddie Gray and end the Freddie Grays dying in the city, across the country, and across the globe. Enough is enough. And thank you all for being with us. Take care.